Hello.
Hi, Lawrence. I think we're
Hey,
just
how
gonna.
are you?
I'm alright. This was such a great program. I'm excited to hear your questions. So I think everybody is set up with a mic now. So I'll go ahead and pass it over to you.
I'm Magdalena too, online here. Do you see Magdalena? Oh, and now I see what we're seeing. Cool.
Hello.
Well, thank you all for coming and for being part of this screening. I just wanted to give a brief introduction, a brief sort of like overview for the audience. So, to my knowledge, being sort of part of the Mimesis remote team here, is that we have Ray Leonovich from Symphonies and Sound on stage, and we have Sepulon Sang from Words Are the Problem on stage, correct? And we have Caroline Johnson from Counter Reformation, and then we have Luis Valdovino from A World in the Evening, which she made with Dan Board. And then we have Magdalena. I'm going to butcher your last name. So we have Magdalena here online from Pictures of a Negative Chair. And I'm from the remote team. So I really, since there's so many of you, I thought I had one sort of introductory question, and then we could leave it open to the floor, so that all those questions get in, because it is quite a diverse program. But one of the things that I ended up thinking about while watching this was this kind of something circling around the notion of research, and thinking about how research figures in your practice and in these films in particular. I know that for Seb it might be a little different, the research, but I'm sure that there's a way of thinking of research also not necessarily only as this sort of intellectual or technical pursuit, but also as kind of an intuitive pursuit that could be an material pursuit. So I guess I'll actually let Magdalena answer, since she's online and has less of access to the room, if you don't mind hitting us off.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to go first, and thank you so much for having me and accommodating me virtually. Yeah, research is a huge part of my practice. I think kind of learning about things, learning about the world is such a big part of my work, and a lot of that happens by a kind of meandering research process. I mean, I don't actually remember how I came across this object of the negative chair, but it was through my research into the history of kind of machine vision in some way. And yeah, part of that process was coming across this scientific article that was about this negative chair, this little sculptural object. And I guess a kind of expanded sense of the word research that went into that was just first seeing images of this object. It was such a kind of optical illusion. Part of the research, I guess, was just trying to kind of reconstruct it to actually create this paper object. And then from there, learning more about this kind of history, and then figuring out um, how to materially render that and kind of expand upon it. The piece ends up being kind of telling this fictional story. So in a way, it starts with research and then kind of goes beyond it in a way.
Thank you. Let's see who's again. I cannot close enough. Let me ask Ray. Ray, what's your relationship to research? You seem pretty heavily researched as well. Your sound piece.
Well, he knows a lot about it because I actually made this for a final in his class. But actually, I feel like mine might have had a less amount of research than anybody else's. I came into it very much knowing that I wanted to make it about sound. I was in a sound design class, and that's where I got that inspiration from. And then I felt that my process was kind of similar to the way you write an essay. Like, you can't finish the thesis until you're almost done. So that's how I kind of felt with it. I did my research on Dr. Drumheller, but then I just let him guide the conversation, and that's how we got to hearing instead of listening.
Luis, do you have thoughts on research?
Test. Yeah, with Dan usually, but in this piece is a little bit of research, but in other pieces we have explore a lot of research sometimes before we start investigating the field. But here was a combination of different things happening at the same time, where the research sometimes we find that going to the world and the landscapes, or buildings that they have an inherent history, and there is and at one point with this metaphor of the night that we were trying to explore, eventually we end up with Goya, but we're exploring different aspects of the night. So once we kind of nail on the idea of Goya using the capricious, then the research of like going to the place where actually they have the whole collection of the actual plates in Madrid, and then but also the idea of like architecture, music, and poetry. There is this interesting quote by Goethe that said that architecture is frozen music, and one of the things I remember with Lorca, studying his works, but then once you go to Granada, for example, you really understand the source of that kind of inspiration. So it's this kind of perceptual understanding of things, and then you understand it through reading and then coming back to experiences. So there are a lot of things that research involves the projects, but most of the time it's almost like one thing that would trigger the next in the possibilities of interrelationship of things. So it's not like you arm a system that then you have to follow. It's something that you constantly founding and moving in different directions as part of the research, so it becomes more fluid in that regard.
No, that's great. And that makes me think of when you think of research, of course, that research most often leads to further questions. So with, and often probably for artists, it leads to new projects and new avenues to pursue. But I thought I would sort of, with new sort of questions in mind, leave it open to the floor if the floor has any questions, because it is quite a big group.
Or if anyone has anything else to say about their research practice.
Yeah. Sure, and then you could go after. Cool. Yeah, that's such a good kickoff question, because my entire film, sort of like you were saying, was a process of researching a ton and then figuring out which avenues I wanted to pursue, and starting off with initial questions that then like either evolve or totally completely change. And I found that the sort of challenge and beauty of shooting on film in particular was that I found, as it relates to research, is I would be, down this thread of research. And as you all probably know, Renaissance art is kind of like an endless abyss of information, and, so much has already been said and researched about it. So I would find myself going down one path, and then I'd be like, okay, I'm going to have this shoot, and I'm going to shoot this, and it's going to mean this in the film. And then it would take like at least a week or two, or sometimes 3, to get the film actually processed and scanned. And like through that period of waiting for the film to come back, I would just be like in a total different direction already, because the research is always happening and always like just ongoing. And so I found probably like in the middle of the project, I had this worry that like none of the footage I shot I was actually going to end up using, because I was like, now it's all different and I don't even know where this is going. And then I think I found that was sort of remarkable was that I did end up finding a way to use most of what I'd shot, but in very different ways than I went into shooting that for. So it was a really beautiful experience, a very like sort of blind experience almost. It didn't really feel like I had a map, but just coming back to the initial questions that you set out with and seeing how those change I loved working like that. I'd never worked like that before. And it's like addicting, I think. Yeah.
I'll go too. So as much as I kind of understand what you were saying, Lawrence, too, where it doesn't really appear researchy in mine, maybe a little bit of history to give there is that Bridget, the subject of this documentary, was actually a contestant on the one and only chainsaw carving reality TV show that exists. That's sort of in like a Great British Bake Off style of like challenges every week, and like the big challenge, the small challenge, and gets judged by this group of professional chainsaw carvers. And what I thought was really interesting was that I started kind of delving into this whole world of reality television and the kind of emotional availability and access that was really demanded of all of its subjects, and how in some ways this paralleled a number of conversations that Bridget and I had had around the art world. And you kind of see her talk about this a little bit, or around general creative activity, where you're always trying to have to make excuses for the choices that you're making, or you're trying to have to be kind of open and available. You have to kind of, like the producers of that reality TV show, they always wanted everybody to cry, and Bridget like refused to cry. She wouldn't give that of herself to the reality TV audience. And I thought that was really interesting. And so I started kind of trying to look into this framework of like thinking around reality television, thinking around this relationship between kind of explanatory text as it relates to creative activities, and then how this all wrapped up into this field of chainsaw carving, wherein it was this kind of like hyper, almost populist, accessible art form that she had kind of really invested herself into. And so in some ways it's like, I don't really watch reality TV show, but like reality TV generally, but that became like a research that I sort of had to do. And I came to know, for those of you that are like familiar with, I'm going to like butcher, I don't know, like there's like Vanderpump Rules or something like that. Like those kind of shows, they have these weird little moments afterwards where they have everyone talk about everything that happened in the episode. And it's like as if you weren't there watching them like screaming and yelling. They'll have like a decompress afterwards where they do this, but it's like a Q&A for everyone and so that sort of inspired a part of the production as well, in terms of like this sort of after the credits, we had like the juice of everything that should have been said during the film itself, like Bridget kind of actually talking and like opening up a little bit. So that's sort of my form of research, I guess, is just like watching TV. So I got it easy.
This might be selfish because it's an excuse to say hello to Magda. But also, I think thinking about the last Q&A and finding through lines through some of the films, I'm struck by, in Magda, your film, and Caroline, your film's embrace of this moment of self-reflexivity or the self-portrait as like a way of engaging with or changing the stakes in terms of the problem of vision or problems of vision maybe and vision and technology that your pieces are working through. I also think that, you know, other of you up on stage right now, although indirectly, Ray, obviously you're kind of like evading the visible, and Zebulon, you're asking questions about what's not said, and we're only seeing. So I wanted to kind of start with maybe Magda and Caroline thinking through some of the more personal stakes at like within technologies or problems of vision, and then maybe if people want to, I just saw that as a through line. If others want to comment on some of those themes in the work.
Yeah, definitely. I can take that first, and then Magda, if you want to go ahead. Yeah, it's interesting because I had no idea that this film would become anything personal. You know, like on this question of research, to me for a while, it felt very, you know, just a little removed and distant from anything personal. But I think what ended up happening was there were so many threads that I was following or trying to follow. And then I had one of my mentors actually said to me, she said, never underestimate the power of a single image. And that really struck me because there's so much information in my film, and I had a really hard time placing myself in an audience perspective of how much, and kind of to your point, I was thinking about this a lot in your film, of how much do you explain versus just let happen, was pretty much like the challenge of my entire film. But once I, you know, immediately the image that came to mind for me was the game of chess, the Sophonie's Anguissola portrait of her sisters playing chess. And I don't know if this, you know, is answering your question exactly, but just really freezing on one image and interrogating why it just like sparked something within me, completely opened up a realm of the personal that I hadn't anticipated. And then that sort of mirrored this, what I think, when we were watching her film, I was like, oh, I hope my film comes after, because Bridget says something about, yeah, just why, you know, what do you want me to say? What is there to say? Can't they just, I don't know, can't they just see it? Exactly. And it's funny because after the first Q&A today, I was like, oh my God, everyone's so smart. I have to like think about what I'm going to talk about. And I just couldn't think of anything. And during your film, I remembered, I was like, oh yeah, one of my initial research sparks was the word versus the image, and how, you know, which is better, for lack of a better word, a way to communicate something as important as spirituality or religion. And as soon as I sort of froze on one image, which is sort of ironic because it's a film, there's, you know, a lot of images, but it really took like freezing and focusing to not just like finish the through line of the film, but for it to end up in this deeply personal place relating to female artists and their, you know, sisters and friends, and being on set as a friend rather than a, you know, boss, I guess. So I don't know if that answers your question, but a lot of thoughts.
Yeah, thanks so much. I think it's an interesting question in terms of my piece, because similarly, I guess I didn't go into it thinking of it as a personal piece, but of course all work is personal on some level. It's things that I'm deeply invested in, kind of working through these ideas, and I think that. I mean, there's like a sneaky self-portrait early in the piece where I kind of slide myself in as the scientist in this kind of found footage sequence, which is maybe like the first kind of insertion of myself. And then in the final act of the piece, I kind of play the prince character at the same time as the narration turns to being in first person. So far, otherwise it's in third person, talking about the scientist, and then the I kind of comes in, and that was a. I mean, all of that section kind of came later in the process of making the piece. Both, deciding to kind of include my own image, which maybe you would know, maybe you wouldn't know. Those of you who don't know me wouldn't know that was me necessarily, but it's maybe a person for one of the first times that we're like seeing a full body, I guess, in the piece. So there's that kind of maybe deepening stakes. But for me, the turning to the I is really what kind of is, I guess, a moment of articulating, if the piece is kind of about these questions around kind of the need for human beings within the science, within this kind of scientific history, and the scientist kind of having this epiphany of like, what if I'm not necessary anymore? Then the last moment is kind of about this prince, but this kind of person articulating his own needs, like maybe even if he's not needed, maybe he needs. So that is to say, I think it is this kind of reflection on my own desires to know and to do things actively in the world, even if it's, I guess, unnecessary, or those desires to kind of piece through information, even if these new technologies are maybe going to be kind of overcoming the necessity of that. So that's why I guess that I brings those kind of, I guess, personal stakes in through the kind of personal desires of that character.
I have one. Sorry. I just need to collect my thoughts a little bit. I think that all of these pieces kind of, Magdalena, obviously your piece deals with geometry. Pictures of a Negative Chair is one of the most beautiful films I've ever seen. That was magnificent. Thank you so much. But I feel like it unlocked this idea of geometry in all of these pieces for me a little bit. Seeing Pictures of a Negative Chair, and sort of and I'm going to get all academic-y here, and I apologize, but Husserl really lamented what he called like the algebra, like making geometry too algebraic, right? Like reducing our spatial awareness and our intuitions of what is geometric to the numerical, to the arithmetic, or to the technical. And I think, Magdalena, your piece deals with the inadequacy, actually, of the technicization of geometry to some extent, right? These images could be reduced to numbers, and they don't really tell us which way the corners go, right? And in the same sense, Zeb, words are the problem. Like, it's sort of resisting this, it's the inadequacy of language in this case to be able to like technicize our understanding of geometry, or that more intuitive. And there's so much geometry in the piece. I mean, just the way that the chainsaw is being wielded, and the different sizes and scales of the objects that appear maybe in the frame, same scale in the frame in the image, but probably not the same when you are actually there and experiencing it in a more intuitive and embodied way. So I'm just, and even, I mean, in World in the Evening, in Luis and Dan's piece, kind of the geometry of architecture and landscape as it relates to kind of an intuition of history was very interesting to me. So I'm just wondering, and I think everyone else had something to do with geometry here, and a certain lack, an inadequacy, like an inability to actually articulate that geometric understanding of the world using recorded media felt present throughout the program. And I just wonder if anyone has thoughts on that.
I might just say something not about my piece, but actually tying in with Ray's and the sort of like broader idea of this kind of like technical image, or what we saw in Magdalena's, where it was like very much so like with the sort of I'm assuming it's like a photogrammetric scan that you used of yourself that you're kind of zooming out from, or maybe it's like a LiDAR. I'm not sure which, but that last image. It just sort of makes me think of this. There's this project wherein a scientist is trying to figure out how to 3D print things from the sounds that they make in order to utilize like audio as a method for being able to understand spatial organization. And this is something that's like very prevalent within the development of things like the metaverse, wherein everyone's really trying to push for spatialized audio. And I thought that there was something really beautiful in yours in terms of like the kind of like the classic sound of like the skateboard on like obviously sidewalk, because you can hear the clicks and everything. And so it does this thing where it like sort of to Eric's point moves beyond geometry, but into this kind of like poetics of space that you can kind of feel like you're in because of those sounds. And I mean, really what that is just the fact that it's like, as much as we may be trying to hyper rationalize everything, there is kind of like an emotive quality that's sort of ineffable. And I think that really comes through nicely in the sounds that exist within yours. And I think that there's some interesting tie-in to the hyper technical that exists in a number of the other pieces that are actually really questioning the capacity to like really see. So I just wanted to kind of make that note as a connection.
Yeah, and I just piggybacking off of that, I would say for my film maybe takes that point into the theological realm in the that is a pretty decent way of also describing like the mystery of the incarnation, which is this belief at the heart of Catholicism that God became man, and no one, and we don't really understand how or the nature of the Trinity, but the invisible became visible. And yeah, I just think that's I definitely agree. Your point speaks like within all of these films in different ways, and I think that's very cool.
Yeah.
Shall I jump in? Sorry for my virtual not being able to read the body cues, but I'll jump in, I suppose, because I've started. Yeah, thanks so much for the question. My mind is going in many places because it's very relevant to different aspects of the piece. I mean, I think that, in the first thing that comes to mind is just like the object itself having such a kind of unusual geometry to it that even in my first encounter of seeing still images of it from different perspectives, it was very hard for me to kind of visualize. So it feels like this almost cognitive artifact, something that's kind of stretching my ability to perceive, this kind of visual riddle that was really probably what intrigued me about it right away. And then the piece is in a way using that object as a kind of metaphor for moving from kind of hypothesis-driven science, which we kind of embodied through this like linear perspective, geometric images we see earlier in the piece, towards data science and this kind of this moment that we're kind of in and heading towards even more of kind of being unmoored. I guess the visual metaphors of kind of seeing more perspectives around a thing and getting a fuller picture kind of are falling apart because we can't possibly comprehend all of the kind of data within a given field. And so it was a helpful, I guess, geometric metaphor of kind of a body that's kind of trying to bend around this thing that is kind of geometrically impossible, and the body is kind of unable to bend that way. And then in terms of this kind of 3D section, the whole piece is so much about this like relationship and tension between 2 and 3 dimensions, and this 3D object is almost just as kind of flat and clunky and unreal as the 2-dimensional images. So those tensions were something I was thinking about a lot. But thanks so much for bringing up geometry.
Luis, did you have something?
No, I mean, I was thinking more also in terms of allegory. I mean, the architecture or differences. I mean, allegory here. I mean, the kind of crazy world we live in, of, you know, as if history hasn't happened in terms of, you know, the rise of fascism all over the place. But the idea of also of conformity, that the the kind of system that conforms. So, but it's very interesting. I mean, you go back to Goya, you go back, and in architecture itself, I mean, there are these interesting foreshadowing and allegorical things that history just keeps coming and teach you a lesson, and it comes back and over and over and over again. So, but at the same time, I mean, those things also have their own level of poetry in that regard. But again, like in the piece of the idea of not having words, but this interconnection between the image, the word, and the sound, to be able to poetically speak in different ways that one doesn't do. You know, poets try to make images and sounds that there is no image at the same time. So, so in that way, there are these interesting playfulness with that, to stay away from the kind of system of conformity. Yeah.
All right. Well, I think that is all the time we have. Thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you, Laura.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank
See you
you.
all.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.